Okay, well, welcome to the Eco Lunch and Learn, our third series brought to you by Bermuda College BESS, Bermuda Environmental Sustainability and Task Force. And today's theme actually was inspired by Glenn Fugler from Imagine Bermuda, who brought to our attention that it is the 70th anniversary to the date, 28th of January, of the rediscovery of the Cahow, Bermuda's native bird. Also, the Bermuda Audubon Society has been key in bringing this together as well. So today we have three expert ornithologists joining us to discuss the rediscovery. We have Dr. David Waynegate, who was the former conservation officer for the Bermuda government. We have his successor, Jeremy Madeira, who's the current principal scientist. And we also have Miguel Mias, who's their mentee, and also a doctoral student at the Memorial University in Newfoundland, who'll be calling in from Hamilton Parish today. So before we get to the discussion, we're going to kick off this Eco Lunch and Learn with a clip of a rare bird who we were given special permission from Lucinda Sperling to show this documentary.
My parents tell me I was a born naturalist, and by the age of 13, I was becoming fascinated with birds and naturally heard about the legend of the Cahow, which everyone said had become extinct. All of the boys used to go to explore the caves. I was a little different from the other boys in that I was sort of aware of the Cahow. There was one particular cave I found a skull and various wing bones, and so I climbed up out of the cave trying to imagine, I wonder what this was like when it had flesh and blood on it. And then I looked up, and in the distance I could see the Castle Harbour Island shimmering on the horizon, and the hair just went up in the back of my neck because I said, I wonder if they're still out there.
A secretive ocean-roaming seabird, it inspired awe and fear. A petrel it took to the skies only at twilight, filling the air with an eerie cry that would evolve into a name, the Cahow.
It seemed impossible that the Cahow had been able to survive, but I had to believe it if I wanted to find it alive. There were no specimens preserved, skins with feathers or anything like that. We didn't have cameras, obviously, in those days. No one drew a picture of a Cahow. All we knew is that it was grey above, white below, with a wicked hooked bill.
A close relative of the albatross, the Cahow was a member of a magical group of seabirds, each with a distinct tube nose and a soaring wingspan. It would now only haunt the landscape with a story of a world forever lost. But unknown to man, a recluse population persisted in secret burrows.
It was nocturnal on the nesting grounds. In the interim, they live entirely on the open ocean, out of sight of land.
It's a great big question mark, mystery of where the bird goes.
It would be left to a handful of dreamers in the centuries to come to believe the Cahow possessed one more attribute: an extraordinary will to survive. 300 years later, a June evening in 1935, an unusual sudden spring storm cast a strange bird off its course, hitting St. David's Lighthouse. What lies beneath the next day is a reappearance of a species that didn't exist.
Nobody thought in their wildest dreams that the Cahow could still be around, because it had been written off as being extinct more than 300 years before.
Within days, the mystery specimen was in New York before Robert Cushman Murphy, curator of birds at the American Museum of Natural History, who was willing to believe in what was thought impossible. He was one of the world's most renowned authorities on birds.
Murphy was beginning to learn a lot more about this mysterious group of nocturnal seabirds all around the world, and he recognized it immediately as the Cahow.
This might have proved that somewhere a relic population of a mystery bird existed, but where escaped even the logic of the world's greatest experts.
1935, the year that Cahow struck St. David's Lighthouse, was also the year I was born.
A bird from a lost world collided with the lighthouse and set in motion a life fated to mark a turning point in the mystery and its solution.
At the time, you were expected to conform, and I was certainly non-conforming. It wasn't just my peers who thought I was weird because of an interest in birds, but the teachers as well, I'm sorry to say. And so it gave me a bit of an inferiority complex.
The young Bermudian's passions had drawn him into the company of Louis Mowbray Jr., whose father of the same name discovered the cave fossils many years before. Louis shared his father's dream of a world where the Cahow could be alive. Together with David, he would soon find out.
Mowbray was a great mentor of mine. From a young age, when I first began developing an interest in birds, I'd paint pictures of what I saw and take them to Mowbray, and Mowbray made me feel like I was already on the frontiers of science.
As David's knowledge grew, his determination strengthened to find a bird which lived on in his imaginings.
I was so inspired. With the help of buddies of mine, we decided we were going to build a kayak. So this was 1950. We built our kayak over the summer. It took a long time, I remember. We made this great expedition from Flats all the way down the North Shore. And then I began to get a little scared because we got out into ocean swell. I looked at the canvas hull of the kayak and thought, how the heck are we ever going to land on these spiky rocks? We would have been in real trouble. These islands are so hard to land on that nobody had ever disturbed them over the centuries.
The swells would only grow as fall moved into winter. For now, David's journey seemed dashed, the riddle of the mystery bird forever unsolved. A second chance arrives with the new year. From New York comes Dr. Robert Cushman Murphy in January 1951. The case for the existence of the Cahow becomes hard to ignore.
They suspected that there might be something out there. The outer islands was the only place that they could be because these were areas where people were not. Based on a guess, Dr. Robert Cushman Murphy came down here. My father had many contacts up in the States, so he knew Dr. Murphy.
Murphy and Mowbray finally faced up to their fascination with a magical bird who had hidden its secrets from the world. On their search for the immortal, they longed to prove once and for all an illusion lived on. Risking their reputations on a hunch, they planned the journey along the rim of the Castle Harbor Islands, one at a time, the very islands bravely attempted by Mowbray's young protege months before. Mowbray wasn't about to let the boy miss out on the adventure.
Mowbray mentioned to Murphy that was this young boy and would he mind if he invited them along on some of their searches. And Murphy is attributed to have said, by all means, bring the boy along. He might be useful climbing cliffs.
But David ran into an obstacle even Mowbray couldn't help him get around.
I was in school and most of their trips were going to be conducted during the work week. I couldn't go.
The search for the Cahow would begin on Thursday, January 25th, with David required to be in class at Saltus Grammar School. But in the early morning hours, a cold front began to move in from the east.
Fortunately, I guess you could call it sheer luck for me, a series of January gales prevented Murphy's expedition from getting out to the crucial Castle Harbour Islands during the school week when I was not available, confining their search to the mainland where there wasn't much hope of finding cows.
On Sunday, January 28th, Murphy and Mowbray, joined by David, departed in clear weather, hoping for better luck. Using code words to protect against curiosity seekers, the expedition within hours approached what they called Island A.
We scrambled ashore in the forenoon, accompanied by a youthful Bermudian ornithologist, David B. Waynegate.
The complexity of their eroded surface was such that there were innumerable deep cavities and crevices where things might be hidden.
In several places, there were holes, fresh earth at the entrances, with soft patches of green and whitish excreta, characteristic of seabirds. Then we located one. By the aid of a flashlight, a bird could be seen in the nest chamber.
The burrows had a lot of sand banked up in it, and we couldn't see over the top. So the first thing we had to do was create like a long burrow hoe and pull all the soil out. And then what took half the day was preparing a noose and on a long pole to extract the bird.
It was the hoped for, but only half anticipated Cahow.
And when he finally pulled the bird out on a noose and Murphy held it up to the sun, I'll never forget his expression, "By gad, the Cahow." And that exclamation echoed around the world in news headlines all the way to Australia and New Zealand. It was like announcing the rediscovery of the dodo. For a long time, the Cahow and the dodo had come to be regarded as symbols of extinction.
The whole story of it being rediscovered after more than 300 years of supposed extinction on an island as small and densely populated as Bermuda was just unbelievable. I mean, how could it have escaped detection?
I think it startled Bermuda. There was a sort of a mood that none of Bermuda's heritage was viable anymore at the time. So that made the rediscovery all the more remarkable.
There is the old story of the phoenix, legendary bird that was born in flame. It rose from the ashes when there was a particular danger or such to the people. It's ironic that Cahow was rediscovered right at the time in history, at the dawn of man having a detrimental effect on the environment. It was almost a symbol of that. No matter how much man detrimentally affected the environment, he could also affect it for good.
A further search for the other Cahow yields only 6 more nesting pairs. Remembering the search for the rare bird, Murphy singles out the young naturalist.
Our watchers had by this time dispersed to their several stations. David Waynegate heard the single soft note more often than the rest of us.
That day was really the life-defining moment for me. I knew exactly what I wanted to do for a career from that moment on. I wanted to be the guy who would get the qualifications and devote my life to bringing the Cahow back from the brink of extinction.
Okay, welcome back. Just for audience members who are listening through our live stream, if you can post questions in the chat room, we'll hopefully be able to answer them throughout, and if there's time at the end as well. So next we're going to interview Dr. David Waynegate, who some of us refer to as our own David Attenborough. He's a globally recognized conservationist and has influenced many young Bermudians to go on to study environmental studies, myself included. So we want to know, who influenced you as a young teenager? Who was your main influencer?
Well, interestingly enough, almost nobody.
it was entirely spontaneous, my interest in nature, from an accidental visit to Spittle Pond one day and seeing some strange birds that I'd never seen anywhere else, and seeing a stream. I'd never been out of Bermuda. I'd never seen a river or a stream, but there was a stream flowing in, and I traced it, and of course it was coming from the south shore, and it was a rough day with a high tide, and the water was spilling over into Spittle Pond, but it just sort of was magically different. And so I started going back time after time, and every time I went, there was something new, and that still applies today. Every time I go to Spittle Pond, there's something exciting, something new. So the inspiration came not from my parents, because they were a musician and legal secretary, and they didn't know quite how to deal with it. It didn't come from my school, because sometimes even the teachers would have ribbed me about being interested in birds. But my parents were very supportive, and they understood that I had something different. And so through Stanley Gascoigne, who was one of the few teachers that I really admired at that time, he advised them to introduce me to visiting naturalists. And one of the most famous was Richard Poe, who was later famous for establishing the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania. And so I met him, and I met other visiting naturalists who I would take to Spittle Pond. And from them, I sort of got into the bird watching community and the conservation community.
Wonderful. So tell us about your journey from that 15-year-old teenager to becoming the authority on Cahow recovery.
That was the dark ages of the Cahow program. And we knew almost nothing about pelagic birds at that time. For instance, we didn't even know that the Cahow had a courtship period in November and a 6-week free egg-laying exodus over Christmas, which meant that around Christmas time, there were no Cahows around to see. Murphy had discovered it, of course, on this date, 28th of January, when they're very active. But after the rediscovery, they employed a couple of voluntary students who were into conservation and natural history to come to Bermuda. But of course, they were in college working for a doctoral degree, so they could only come in the Christmas holidays. And that was during the Exodus. And so the first one that came wrote an article to the effect that the shock of rediscovery must have scared them all away. That was how little we know about them at that time. So it was the third of the visiting naturalists from university that were hired under a grant from the American Museum that actually stayed long enough to learn something about the Cahow with William Mowbray. And it was in 1963-64 that they discovered that the longtail was the main problem affecting the Cahow, not rats, as they previously thought. They thought rats swimming up to the island were the problem, but it was really nest site competition with the longtail, which was, of course, much more abundant. And the longtails were nesting in all of the cliff holes in the Castle Harbor Islands. The Cahow was really out of habitat by that time because the cats and dogs in the mainland had driven them from the mainland of Bermuda to small offshore islands, which didn't have any soil cover for burrowing, so there was no nest site separation. And so all of the Cahows were trying to nest in longtail nests. That was the only choice they had. And that's why so many of them were infected. That was the main limiting factor, which had kept them so rare on the verge of extinction for all those centuries.
Wonderful. So it's hard to choose, but I'm sure because you've had a lifelong of achievements, but what is your proudest achievement?
I would say, because I missed rediscovering the Cahow by a year, if you saw that short script, I would have rediscovered them the year before with my friend Henry and Charlie Zool if it had been a kayak that we had to try and land on the islands with. So I missed rediscovering the Cahow ahead of Murphy by a year. I kind of knew it was out there. And So it was my rediscovery of the black-capped petrel, which nests in the mountains of the Caribbean islands, particularly Haiti and Dominican Republic, that I regard as perhaps my proudest moment, because I did rediscover that one, which had been lost to science for about a century. So that, and the other thing, of course, is the Non-Search Living Museum. Because as a result of my interest in the Cahow, I became interested in Non-Search, the biggest island in that area, which I passed every day when I went to check the Cahows. And I lobbied the government to see if we could get it made into a nature reserve for the future of the Cahow, when we could get them to expand and spill back over onto the bigger islands where there was soil cover, so that they could achieve the original niche separation between the longtail and the Cahow. And I was very lucky that, in fact, the government basically said to me, if you're crazy enough to live out on that island without telephone and electricity, go ahead, you can have it all yourself, do what you want out there. Can you imagine, Jeremy, getting something like that?
It's difficult.
So I moved out in 1962 with my young family. My wife was bold enough to take that plunge with me, and we just loved it, and my children loved it, for the moment. We lived out there, a whole world to ourselves, and I could look out over the Castle Harbour Islands. What makes that my other proudest moment is that I was able to develop Non-Search into the living museum that it is now, through a holistic approach to restoration, restoring the botany and the other rare species in addition to the Cahow, but always hoping that one day the Cahow would either spill over back onto Non-Search or get there. And of course, that was Jeremy's achievement.
Yeah, which we'll look forward to hearing about soon. So life as an environmentalist or conservationist never stops, and you don't seem to stop. So what are you still working on, or what are you working on currently, and what are your future hopes?
Well, I was so pleased with Jeremy's takeover of the Cahow program that I just felt after a couple of years that I could just walk away from it. And he had the benefit of going to Australia to learn techniques, including techniques for translocating Cahows. And so he brought all this information back, and I realized that he now knew more than I did for the particular stage that the program had reached. And so my main interest then became in botanical restoration, which was probably the biggest workload sort of in the latter part of my career, looking after the Cahow. That became a routine, but Non-Search became my main focus, and restoring things like the yellow-crowned nighthare and the West Indian topshell, and mainly reforestation, planting native trees, so it's now a mature native forest out there. And that's what I'm primarily working on now. I'm so dismayed by the impact that invasive plants are having on the native flora of Bermuda that I've just completed writing a fairly extensive treatise on the subject and hoping to get it published with illustrations. In fact, I'm speaking to Alison Copeland about that just the other day.
Yeah.
And we're hoping that we can combine the botanical field guide that she has produced with this into one published document. So we're looking for a sponsor.
Yes, and hopefully we can get it in all the schools. I need them for my class for sure. So sponsors are welcome. So just to capture your more inspiration from you and advice, how can we, or what would you suggest to motivate and inspire young people to become active, engaged environmentalists?
Well, there's only some that you will, unfortunately. In my experience, people with an interest in natural history seem to have it internally, and they're always, attracted by it, inspired by it. But people who don't have that, there's two reasons. One, they just don't have it in their system, but the other is that they're not exposed to it. So I think that the most important thing we can do is expose as many school students to the outdoors and to the adventure of discovering nature as we possibly can. A lot of students, they grow up in urban areas, they just don't have this contact except maybe through television documentaries. But the excitement of discovering things on your own in nature, and there's always something to discover. I'd like to put in a plug for the Bermuda Zoological Society's Trunk Island project. They invited me to sort of use my experience from developing non-search in developing another living museum out on Trunk Island, but this one devoted to education. And more and more students, groups are going out there. I think it's something like 3,000 people a year or something going out there. And it's fast. I call it non-search on steroids because we're using all the benefit of what I learned from bitter experience out of non-search. And we're using volunteers from the schools and adult volunteers, parents and children. And as they learn through their volunteering work on restoration, they start to apply that in their own home environments. And so more and more gardens in Bermuda are becoming native restored. And the students are exposed to nature, and a lot of them are taking off from that far more than they were in my time. And so, Miguel is a classic example. Somebody who's just been inspired by birding and is now broadening his experience. And I think he's looking forward to taking over from Jeremy.
Well, that is a wonderful segue. I couldn't have done it better myself. So we have Miguel here to talk about his inspiration and what he's studying currently. Thanks, Miguel.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, thank you for, first of all, hosting this event. Yeah, wow. There's a lot to take in for sure. I don't know, I just think, I don't know where to start. Honestly, I think like destiny's a funny thing, because I remember David used to tell me stories of how he followed like the famous naturalist like William Beebe, who actually took up residence on Nonsuch Island in the early to mid 1900s. And Beebe wrote this extensive book about his adventures on Nonsuch Island. And David would read this book as a kid, and David used to dream like, man, I hope I get to live out on Nonsuch one day. And then look what happened. He ended up discovering the Cahow, and then which led to him living on Nonsuch, and that in turn influenced like Jeremy's path of becoming the conservationist he is today. And then both Jeremy and David influenced me, and I wasn't even born, so it's just a lot to it's crazy when you zoom back and just think of like how all these dominoes just like fell into place. But yeah, when I met David, I think I was 22 years old, and I was actually introduced to David formally by a friend of mine who lived in the East End, which was kind of ironic because David was actually my neighbor growing up this whole time. Like I have memories of David as a schoolboy. Like when I was a schoolboy, I used to see him bird watching in the neighborhood like all the time, not realizing what he was doing. And even when I was formally introduced to him as a young man, I still didn't know much about him. Like I knew his name, but I didn't know anything about his accomplishments, what he had done. But my friend had invited me onto one of David's outings, and but ignorance was bliss because it actually made getting to know David so much easier because there was no intimidation factor because I was just so ignorant. I just didn't know him. So gradually I was like spoon-fed and made to realize like, this guy's a juggernaut, isn't he? I'm like that one friend who knows about the Star Wars series, but has like never watched a single film. Like that was me when I first met David. But he's instilled like so many things. Both him and Jeremy have instilled a lot of things inside of me and passion. But one thing I've learned from David a lot is that he drills into me is the species that we see in Bermuda today, like the number, they pale into comparison to what existed during pre-colonial times. So when I like to think of Bermuda as like a checkerboard sitting on top of a table, right? And this game is like millions of years old. So the millions of years that followed Bermuda's birth from that volcano, different plants and animals gradually arrived. They interacted, they played this game, and they evolved together, they coexisted, and they created this delicate balance. And they were able to play this game pretty much undisturbed for millions of years. And then bam, 1609 comes. humans arrive, and we as humans, we just grab the table and we just flipped it. Pieces went everywhere. Some of the players have left the game for good, and when I mean left, they went extinct, all because of human activity. We've changed the rules of this game so much. And we know this too because in David's youth, he used to also explore caves all throughout Bermuda. And him and his colleagues discovered all sorts of fossils and bones. And in some cases, sorry, is that me? Am I typing? Oh, what happened?
You're okay. You're okay.
Oh, I'm okay. Oh, okay, cool. Sorry. Cool.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Cool. Okay, cool. Yeah. So in some cases, he actually discovered like whole specimens, like of whole birds, like skeletons. So he actually like sent these skeletons off to be examined and compared to other museums. And sure enough, none of these specimens quite matched anything that these overseas museums had in their collection. And that's simply because these were the remains of a lot of endemic birds that were unique to Bermuda, just like the Cahow was. So, for example, we had our own crow, our own hawk, heron, woodpecker, towhee, owl, like you name it. It was there, and a lot of these things went extinct, unfortunately, because of our own the behavior of our ancestors. Consequences we still feel in the 21st century, like today. But just like Jeremy and David, I have the privilege of actually studying a bird that survived human settlement, called the white-eyed vireo, or the chick of the village. You can actually have a picture of it. You can barely see it. This is awkward. It's right there. But it's a very small, tiny green bird, gray head. The adults have beautiful pearly white eyes. And these birds, unlike the Cahow, however, these birds are still very much abundant throughout Bermuda. So my job as a PhD student is to go out throughout Bermuda, use mist nets, which David has a lot of experience with as well, to catch these birds, put little collar bands on their legs, and then I can actually follow them around and tell, okay, like how long do these birds live for, which individuals are paired together for nesting, how big are their territories, etc. And Jeremy's also applied similar banding techniques with the Cahow, which he will certainly elaborate on his talk. But I have so much respect for the white-eyed vireo of Bermuda because we've changed the habitat so much. Like, think of all of the birds that didn't make it, and didn't adapt to the change that humans have caused to Bermuda. If you look outside Bermuda right now, we're surrounded by about 90 to 95% exotic invasive trees. And this little bird, no bigger than a small chicken drumstick, has survived all of that and is still thriving quite well to this day. So before I guess one more quick story I'd like to share with you. I have a picture because I think when you hear a story like David's, I think most people think like, wow, like what else is there left to discover? Like there's probably nothing that can top that or match that. So if you're out there, if you're thinking about pursuing a career in natural history, conservation, even though it's not about the fame per se, like there's always something to learn. There's always something to discover. And you're not going to find it sitting in your home and in these four walls. You got to go out and explore. So in the summer of 2018, in July, David and I were doing a seabird survey in the Hamilton Harbor Islands. And we approached this little island, and we were greeted by these, we were actually attacked by this pair of rosier terns. And this was very peculiar because rosier terns actually, they were extirpated. They were locally extinct. They hadn't been recorded breeding in Bermuda since the 1870s. So these terns, when they approached us, as we approached their island via boat, they circled our boat. They were calling, trying to dive bomb us. I looked at David, and he goes, check the island, there could be an egg. So I hop off, and sure enough, within 5 minutes, I located a single rosier tern egg. And I've got this picture that I'd like to share with you. Hope you can see it, okay? So about 3 weeks later, that egg hatched, and there I am holding the first rosier tern chick to hatch in nearly 200 years. And what better person to experience that moment with is David Waynegate himself. And before I realized it, I'm having my own Cahow rediscovery moment with the legend himself. So I guess it just goes to show that, there's still things out there to learn and to explore. And I just strongly believe that we as Bermudians are obligated to preserve and protect what species are left in Bermuda.
Wonderful. Thank you, Miguel. That was amazing presentation. And it's so great to see how you grown and become this PhD student studying and being a mentee of David and Jeremy, and what an amazing experience you've had.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have a question?
A comment,
Oh, yeah, a comment.
and another person who has been inspired by you, which I think is lovely. Gary Taylor says, they, meaning David and Miguel, inspired me to start studying environmental science with Amy at Bermuda College. I now have a master's degree in forest conservation from the University of Toronto. That's Gary Taylor. So
Nice.
it's wonderful how the influence that has been there is just great.
Yeah, I know Gary very well. We used to skin birds together in the museum. Congratulations, Gary, man. Great to hear it.
Congratulations, another student. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Miguel. Well, we'll move over to Jeremy Madeira, who can
Sounds good.
bring everything together, hopefully, for us about this story of the Cahow and all of its successes and some pitfalls, maybe, and things to look for. So thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah. Well, I guess I had the fortune, I guess, of working for a number of years with David. Before I took over that project from him, and I believe I started as a government apprentice, part of the Agriculture and Fisheries Apprenticeship Program in 1984. And I think that was shortly after a documentary had appeared on local television, and it was about the early stages of Nonsuch and David. And I've always had a deep interest in the environment, and particularly in Bermuda's environment and native species and such. So it was a shoe-in. I was fascinated, and I had been working since graduating from school at my family's business for several years. And when this opportunity arose to join the apprenticeship program, I jumped at it. And one of my first assignment, in fact, it wasn't one, it was the first, was working with David in the conservation division within agriculture and fisheries then. It's gone through several iterations now. It's Department of Environment and Natural Resources that I work for. But I started working as an apprentice, and that's my first real exposure to both the Cahow project and the amazing work that David had done out on Nonsuch Island, and was doing in other nature reserves throughout Bermuda. It's not just Nonsuch, it's many reserves everywhere you look. And I must confess, I was a plant guy at first. My real interest was in native and endemic plants, but I got completely corrupted by the Cahow. My exposure to the Cahow, because at that point, David has mentioned that we knew very little about it. And what David had was the very difficult job of addressing all of these threats that were affecting it when it was first rediscovered. I mean, the tropic birds, how to control that. And it was by basically creating a specially sized door that could let the Cahow in, but not the tropic bird or the longtail, I should say. Rats getting out to the island. To this day, we have a rat baiting and control program in all the islands because they can't really survive in the presence of rats and such. They do have an impact on very young chicks, for example. And then there were many other things, a lack of breeding holes because these were rocks. There was no soil on them because it had all been washed off, because these things are tiny. They're tiny little half-acre rocks that are completely submerged during hurricanes, and somehow they had clung to survival on there. And this just, as an idealistic young man at that point, I was absolutely taken in by this idea, and even more taken in by the fact that we knew so little about it. We knew almost nowhere about where it went out at sea, and the technology did not exist to find that out at that time. There were a couple of reports off of North Carolina, and that was it, so we knew it probably went that far. And there was no way to track them. There was no way to really show it to the public, because these rocks were and continue to be very difficult to land on, or life-threatening to land on, particularly in rough weather. And so we didn't have any way of bringing that. So I think a lot of people assumed that the Cahow was a figment of David Waynegate's and mine and a few others' imaginations, more or less, because they it was very rare to actually have an opportunity to see them. So as I, worked through my government career, I went to college in the UK, got my degree, and then came back and I worked in the Parks Department as a superintendent, but volunteered to help out David on weekends and whenever I could to get out there and do that. And so when eventually David retired in 2000 and I took over, I was, had these huge footsteps to follow, of course. It's very difficult to, it's rather hair-raising at first, I must admit, the first few years. But I think the catalyst for me was that I got the opportunity to go to Australia and work with the New South Wales Department of Environment and Climate Change. And Nicholas Carlisle was a pivotal, I think, figure in what's happened since with the Cahow, because he was traveling the world on a Churchill scholarship looking at seabird projects around the world, and came to it and he said, well, look, why don't we come to Bermuda and come to Australia, and we can show you that we have this technique of translocating near-fledged chicks to a new area that it may be applicable to the Cahow. We don't know. You would have to gather a lot of data, and also to give me experience in handling these birds, because up until then we really didn't know enough about them to risk handling these birds, because they were so incredibly rare. And, the real concern was that by handling them, that could affect their breeding, and they wouldn't breed, or they'd break the egg by being disturbed. So I went down there, found out that this family of seabirds is quite plastic. You can do a lot with it. You can handle it all the time, and it won't really affect its behavior. And that's the main thing, was finding out this new technique called translocation. You track the chicks, you weigh them, measure them, literally from the time they hatch until they're about 3 weeks before fledging, flying out to sea. And if you get them right at that time, you have a 3-day window, you can take them out of the original nest on these horrible little islands, which are crumbling away like sugar cubes, more or less here, move them to new burrows and one such, and put them in, and then hand feed them for the next 3 weeks. And then they start coming out at night, and they imprint on this new site rather than that original little rock. The whole process is called translocation, and it was very new. Only the New Zealanders and in Australia had they done it with this family of seabirds. Other people like Dr. Steve Kress had done it with puffins in Maine and such, but it was a new procedure, and so it was taking a risk. But the thing that made me accelerate it was Hurricane Fabian in 2003. It caused such damage and destruction on those original nesting islands that I just thought, well, if we don't do something very soon, and we have another hurricane like that, we lose a couple of those islands, we'll be into a declining population that we may not be able to pull it out of anymore. And so as a matter of urgency, I followed that. And all I can say is that it was successful between, beyond my, and I think David's, and anybody associated with the Cahow, would be beyond our expectations. We had almost half of the birds. I moved 100 plus birds in 5 years, almost half of them returned. So we actually did better than the parents. A third of their chicks returned. But I spoiled my children, and I fed them right up to departure rather than cutting off the food a week or two before. They went out fatter and able to spend more time looking for food and how to catch it. And so almost 50% of those translocated chicks returned. And by 2009, I think certainly the high point of my career, I don't think I'll ever top it. We had a few birds that came in, and I knew, because I banned all of the chicks now, about 90% of the population is banded, fitted with identification bands, so we can follow them for their life. And finally, something that had never really happened before happened. I was out there one day, or one night, I should say, dark, stormy night, and Cahow started flying overhead where I had moved them to. I was sitting there in the middle of the burrow complex, and we had a sound system going, playing back their calls, and the birds started flying in, and they started landing, and I picked them up, and sure enough, this was one of the birds that I had, raised as a chick, helped raise, 4 years before, had returned, And within a week or two, I had 4 or 5 of them. And that's when I thought, that was the eureka moment. I just thought, maybe this just is going to work. You know, this whole thing, this gamble that we took. And the next year, we had the first chick that had been hatched naturally on Nonsuch since the 1620s from one of a pair made up of these returned birds. That was 11 years ago. As of yesterday, because I was just out there in the island yesterday before this oncoming storm we're supposed to have later, we were out there, and I can report that we did 2 sites. That was so successful, I did another translocation to another site on Nonsuch, and as of now, we have nearly 30 pairs of Cahows nesting on Nonsuch Island. It's about 26 of them have produced eggs this year, and we have another, at least 4 or 5. We discovered a new pair yesterday that have occupied nests together, you know, these artificial. And it seems that they're attracting now young birds from all 4 of the other islands. And so that's a real, Nonsuch has room for thousands of pairs. So my great contribution, I think, to the whole Cahow recovery program has been to get them on a high island that has room for literally 5,000 plus pairs. Nonsuch by itself could really help to save the long-term future of the species. And it is our national bird. It's Bermuda's official national bird. By proclamation from 2003, it was recognized as being unique to the island and a tough survivor. And so it was thought to be a worthy sort of representative of Bermuda for that. And, you know, basically, I think that was the single most important thing that I've been able to accomplish on that. But we've gone on, and where my thing is use technology, new technologies becoming available on a yearly basis that enables us to do things we've never done before. And, you know, we're tracking them. We have a project going right now, a 3-year project. It's been somewhat disrupted by the COVID pandemic and such, but I've actually got, and I actually have one, yeah. We have these new, the newest little GLSs, which fit onto the legs of Cahows. It's 1.1 gram. I'm not even sure if that can be seen or whatever. Yeah, I'll let you do that. But once the little zip tie is cut off, it's only a 1.1 gram thing, and this can track the birds for up to 2 years. And then you have to recapture the bird in the nest and download all of the data and then run a program. It'll throw up a map of where it's been. And this is, you know, these things are doing probably one of the most elusive things that I know David and I talked about it for years and such when I was an apprentice and everything. And we were like, man, that would be the most amazing thing to find out where did they go. And as I think it's shown on the PowerPoint that has been playing, our big discovery is that these guys go all the way to European borders. In fact, we've been able to make a map of where they go to the Atlantic, and it encompasses almost the entire North Atlantic Ocean. It's millions of square miles. And I think that was a key to their survival. Although they were stuck on just a very few small islands in Bermuda, they had millions of square miles of ocean to gather food from. And they're amazing flyers. We've tracked them flying 300 and 400 miles in a day. A storm like this, they love because it's free energy. They use the wings to slingshot them to their areas. So this has really helped us to understand you know, how they managed to hang on for so long at such a small number. And also it helps us to identify threats perhaps overseas. We can do all this work to control threats here in Bermuda on their breeding grounds, but most of their life they're living out in the open ocean. They don't approach land anywhere except here at their breeding islands. They most likely don't even come within sight of land anywhere else. They live their entire life as a pelagic species in the open ocean. They can sleep while flying, and they can, you know, just if they don't find food in one area, they can easily travel several hundred miles in a day to find a new food source. So these are all things that it's helped to inform efforts to create marine protected areas, for example, in the Azores. That is underway right now And the Cahow is one of the key things, this data that we've gotten from these little tags, showing that a critically endangered species, this is a very important area for them to feed in during the non-breeding season. But it also helps all of the other seabirds, whale species. Most of the whales in the North Atlantic go to this area. Most of the seabird species, it's a key site north of the Azores, and efforts are underway by the European Union and the Azores, government of the Azores, and other entities to create the largest marine protected area. So the Cahow has had its little part to play in something that's going to protect the whole North Atlantic ecosystem, by this giant multi-million square mile protected area. So that's what I've always thought, is if what we do here can help other species, other endangered species around the planet, because more and more species are being impacted by, man's activities. Despite a lot of denial about the situation, we are affecting the planet. We are affecting the climate. People need to really just trust the science on that. It's absolutely, inarguable now. It's happening, and we've seen it in our careers. We've seen sea level rise. Rocks we used to jump on are underwater now permanently, and it's very alarming when you see that in your short lifespan. But I think the biggest thing, and I think both Miguel and David have touched on, is educating the next generation to do better than we have, and to follow on from that work. And one of the biggest objectives of the Cahow recovery program, which is really respected, it's one of the longest continuous recovery programs for an endangered species anywhere on the planet, and it's quite well regarded, I think, in international scientific circles and conservation circles, is that, one of my main objectives was increasing public education and outreach. And that's, again, technology has come to our aid. JP Rouge and Bermuda and Cornell Bird Laboratory have partnered with us now. And so we've been able, over the last 5 or 6 years, to bring the Cahow cams now. So you can go on to www.nonesuchexpeditions, and you can see 2 different Cahow pairs inside the nest burrows. These are infrared lights. The birds can't see them. It appears totally dark, so it doesn't affect their behavior. And you can watch what's happening, on a nightly basis. It's live streamed, so you're seeing it as it happens. And we have a camera set up on the south side of Nonesuch. So at night, it's infrared as well. At night, you can see them come in and doing their courtship, flying and landing and taking off. I'll be interested to watch it tonight when this storm hits, because you'll see cows probably coming in and flying around in near hurricane force gusts. So all of this, this has been an invaluable part. We can't take tours up there because of the pandemic. We normally have 60 plus tours a year, up to 15 to 1,800 people. Most of those are school or educational tours, but at the moment that's not an option. So the Cahow cams are really filling the gap, and not just for Bermuda, but we have viewers from all around the world now. So it's really all of it. There's too much to even go into detail. I could go on all day, but certainly those are, I think, the 3 most important developments. All of them really aided by technology and in advances in technology. The more we find, we don't have, we don't know yet. And every question answered creates 10 new questions. And that's why, anybody wants to go into this line of work and this career, there'll never be a loss of questions. Man changing the environment, the ecosystem of the planet, is creating all sorts of new challenges that will have to be addressed by future generations. And so I would say that the age of discovery is not over at all. It's only beginning. It's that I think it's going to be more and more important to have people like us doing this work, because otherwise we're going to lose more and more of these species and the rich diversity of the montage of habitats and species that make up this planet and make it possible for us to survive. So, I don't know.
And it's very daunting. But between the two of you have, I don't know how many decades of experience and knowledge. But we've seen so many changes. What do you think are the most pressing environmental impacts that is faced today in Bermuda? Not just at the Cahow, but in general.
Yeah, invasive species. I would second David on that, and not just in Bermuda, but worldwide. Invasive species are having, and this has been, it's important to note, this has almost been totally created by man, because we can move things legally or illegally to different countries and continents so quickly. So yeah, I mean, David has actually seen this much longer than I have, but I remember searching for Brazil peppers because my mother wanted me to collect some for Christmas decorations, and I couldn't find any. And this was in probably the mid 1960s or something like that. They were there, but they were very rare. God, how I wish they were still rare, but I think they're everywhere in Bermuda now, except on the reefs and in caves. But they've taken over the island, and they suppress all of these other native things. I mean, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I would say sea level rise, because I've been around a lot longer than you, and I can actually see the sea level rise that's happened in my lifetime. And of course, it's accelerating. It is. And that's one of the reasons I'm happy you got the Cahows onto notches, because those islands are going to disappear. Hurricanes are more intense, so that magnifies the effect of sea level rise. So that's my my thought about the most challenging thing we face.
I would second that too. And I mean, Bermuda is lucky in that it's hilly. It has fairly hilly topography, but flatter areas of land and islands and coastal areas are going to be, I mean, we have basically committed ourselves to a course of action that's in many of our lifetimes, we're going to see just horrendous problems. I mean, Greenland is gone. That can raise sea level by itself 25 feet, and that's not even counting in Antarctica. And everything is melting now at the worst case scenario from all of the projections given just a few years ago. So I think we've committed ourselves to this. And I mean, places like New Orleans and places like Miami and all of South Florida, south of Orlando, really are, it's not a made up thing. It's not, you get skeptics that say, oh, the climate's always changed. Yes, but it's changing out thousands of times its normal rate. We can't, and natural processes can't adapt fast enough. And just imagine if Miami gets to be the new Venice of the West, and it's an island until the next big hurricane completely destroys it, because it'll be essentially underwater. So I think it's things we're going to see increasing events. I may not see them, or David in our lifetime see it really become catastrophic, but many of the viewers are going to see this. And it just takes a little bit of international cooperation. And breaking the deadlock that's happened now, and just committing everybody to look. We have to stop thinking about ourselves, and the bottom line for us here, we have to think about the next generation, our children and grandchildren, and the fifth generation. So that's what I think we have to do.
It's not fake news, folks.
It really is.
Absolutely not. Yeah, it's time to definitely, like you say, collaborate locally and globally. We're all interconnected. One of my pet peeves is ocean plastic pollution. And I was just wondering, have you noticed any impact on the cows?
We haven't. I say that somewhat reservedly, because many seabirds, albatrosses, for example, which are distantly related to Cahows, they tend to surface pick things from the surface, and they've had a horrendous time with gathering, plastic debris, thinking it's fish eggs or plankton and such, and feeding it to their chicks, and the chicks become completely stuffed with plastic and die, and we're very fortunate in that all of the samples that we've ever done with Cahows and longtails as well, thank goodness, are two major seabird species, their type of feeding doesn't seem to create that problem. We've never found plastics in them. We've never found plastics in any of the chicks that have just died naturally and we've autopsied. I'm sure it's happening on some level, like plastics break down eventually into almost microscopic particles. Things are eating that, and some of the things that Cahow is eating may be eating, you know, microscopic sized plastic particles. It's everywhere in the ocean, from top to bottom, and so almost everything in the ocean is becoming contaminated to some degree from it. So I'm sure on some level it is, but at least it's not the big chunks that can either poison them or suffocate them. So we're very fortunate with that, but because there certainly has been a huge accelerated increase in the amount of plastic coming ashore. We collected on such on the little beach there, and we used to get like a boatload in a year, I think, when I first started working with you, that you could dispose of easily. And now we have about a boatload every month or so. Wow. So, you know, it's sometimes the sargassum seaweed comes in choked with pieces of plastic, and you can see the shorebirds trying to find actual living things to eat. And, you know, there's so much plastic particles, it's hard for them to find it. And we don't know if that's poisoning some of the planktonic stuff, because it breaks down into poisonous compounds.
And it also soaks up chemical waste as well.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, we solved the oil issue. The big issue when I was a kid was oil pollution and tar holes. You couldn't walk on the beach in Bermuda without having tar stuck all to your feet, and great big deposits of it on the rocks. And it was an international agreement that was put into law where oil tankers could not flush out their tanks anymore at sea, getting ready for the next load, and they had to have double bottoms, which cut down hugely on the amount of oil spills that were happening. And now it's very rare to hear of or see a major oil spill. You know, it happens, but it's not happening on a weekly basis like it was, you know, certainly when I was younger. So if we solved that crisis, we can certainly solve the plastic crisis. It just needs an international agreement and sticking to that agreement, and not letting people go off, and educating people. Don't throw their plastic bottle overboard, something like that.
And so, just reducing the dependence on plastic.
Exactly. So yeah, if we created the problem, we could certainly solve the problem.
Yeah, well, that's a hopeful note to finish on. And I just want to thank all of our panelists today for their knowledge and their dedication to conserving such a special species for Bermuda. I wish Miguel all the best in his final chapter of his PhD. Yeah. And it's just been a great experience. So thank you all for listening, and wonderful to have Dr. Waynegate and Mr. Jeremy Madeira with us here on campus. And everyone stay safe in the gale. Thank you.
Take care. Congratulations to you both. Thank you.
Okay, good to see you, Miguel.
Likewise.